Hello to all of you, and welcome to another of our Sped Ahead online professional development webinars. I'm your host, Clay Whitehead, co-founder and co-CEO of Presence Learning, your sponsor for this program. This program has continued to amaze us with the huge audiences that attend. Special education administrators, educators, and clinicians across the country are participating by the thousands in our professional learning community. They are also working with us every day to connect students with special needs to clinical services they need via our online therapy solution. We titled this series Eureka because we wanted to share some big ideas and spark new thinking. It's doing just that. We're getting fantastic reviews, and I want to personally thank you for your positive comments and encouragement. The presenters are thrilled to share new approaches to help all of your students achieve. Dr. Lori Desautels started us off with a look at neuroscience for teaching and learning with a big idea for how our brains, and not just our classrooms, really are the learning environment. Lori dished up many practical suggestions and gave lots of examples of how to condition our brains for teaching and our students' brains to learn. We have had so many positive comments come in, so thank you and thanks to Lori. Please encourage your colleagues to watch the recording if they missed it. Then, following Lori, Dr. Margot Izzo and Laderick Horn had us all feeling emotional and touched by their insights into students with hidden disabilities. So Margot and Laderick gave us big ideas for empowering our students who may appear to be typical, but whose disabilities are not visible to us. As you know, this is a growing population that presents us with some real challenges. If you missed this presentation and the lively Q&A session that followed, take time to watch the recording and share it with your friends. Today, we're wrapping up the series with someone who is no stranger to educators, Dr. Randy Sprick. As you know, Randy is a very popular keynoter at education conferences and conducts workshops with school districts across the country. He inspires audiences and he entertains, but he also provides some very effective strategies for creating safe and civil schools, an important goal for all educators. The big idea Randy shares during this webinar is the STOIC framework for improving student behavior. Get ready for some great stuff. But before Randy takes over, I'd like to share his background and experience. Randy is the director of Teaching Strategies, Inc., and the lead consultant for Safe and Civil Schools. Over 40 years ago, Randy began his career as a teacher assistant and became a special education teacher 2 years later. He now provides practical advice for creating schools and classrooms that encourage student responsibility and motivation while humanely and effectively helping students learn to behave in more responsible ways. Randy's articles, books, and multimedia programs are valuable resources for school personnel in dealing with issues of discipline and classroom management. Randy is past president and Hall of Fame inductee of the Association for Direct Instruction. In 2007, the Council for Exceptional Children honored Randy with the J.E. Wallen Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing his work in developing, advocating, and proliferating positive behavior supports in schools. Randy, we're honored to host you today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Clay, and thank you for allowing me to be part of the great work that you're doing at Presence Learning. Just letting the listeners know, there is a resource list that goes along with this that has the references to some of my materials that go into a little bit more depth than we have an opportunity to do within the limited time of this webinar. Clay, I'd also like to thank you and Presence Learning for having me be part of the series with Lori and Margot and Laderick. The work that Lori is doing on the neuroscience of behavior and engagement fits so well with this work that I get to move into with things. Although there were many, many things that I took away from being able to participate in her portion of the webinar, one of the things that was so important for me was trying to get people to move away from thinking, what is wrong with this student, to thinking more in terms of what happened to this student or what is this student's story, and thinking deeply. I have the distinct pleasure to be able to add to this series by going hopefully even more deeply into what we, the teacher, can do to have a positive impact on behavior, and whether that behavior is an outgrowth of an overt disability, a hidden disability, post-traumatic stress, or any of the other factors that the other presenters have helped make us aware of. We, the teacher, always have to deal with that behavior. So by way of getting started, I want to just begin with that the goal of working on behavior and the category that we refer to as positive behavior support is basically to create such physical safety within the school, such social interactional civility within the school between adults and kids, kids and adults, kids and kids, adults and adults, such civility that there are no barriers to academic productivity. So I'm going to talk just within this introductory piece about reducing the behaviors that interfere with learning and why that's important. That'll be quick. But also reducing the frustration of staff regarding student behavior, reducing the degree to which staff over-depend on corrective consequences to try to shape those behaviors that interfere, and then setting up the rest of my talk, which is viewing misbehavior as a puzzle to be solved, not a threat that needs to be squashed or somehow eliminated. So with that said, let's just start with an acknowledgement that the teacher's job is really, really tough because there are all kinds of behaviors that students may exhibit that interfere with the smooth running of our classroom and that interfere with an individual student's potential to be successful within our room and an individual student's behavior who can interfere with the learning of others as well. And it's small things like off-task behavior, but it's also big things like refusal to follow directions. It's seemingly maybe trivial things like excessive movement, but that can cause big problems. And too much movement, particularly in a crowded classroom, can lead to social interaction problems between kids that could accelerate into a physical shoving match real quickly. It's seemingly small things like electronics, but if kids are distracted with electronics in the classroom when they should be paying attention to a cooperative group activity, all of those things are barriers to learning. Consequently, we as teachers, because these are inevitable, these are things that real children do, these are going to happen, and we need to think about what we're going to be doing about those kinds of things. In part because the behaviors that students exhibit can be very, very frustrating to us as teachers. And some of these behaviors on the more severe end of things can actually pose a direct threat to our authority. And let me get at that one with a common situation. We've just got a picture here of a classroom, and what you see in the background is the teacher is doing what a good teacher does during an independent work activity, physically circulating, visually scanning around the room. In the foreground, you'll see we have a student engaged in a minor misbehavior off task. The teacher in his circulating now notices that the student is off task. The teacher does what most of us would do. It's not a real strong procedure, but without thinking, we'll tend to make a beeline over to the student. We'll get in the student's face, more or less, and Lori talked about this. This is not a good position to put a student in, and we'll say, you need to get to work. And regardless of the reasons why, it is very possible that this student is going to respond with, you can't make me, which has the teacher reflect and realize, oh my gosh, this student is correct. I can't make him, which is literally a metaphoric slap in the face to the teacher because that teacher realized I can't make this kid. Now, what that can result in is when any of us are threatened, and Lori talked about this in terms of kids and staff, I want to talk about it specifically as staff, when any of us are threatened, we physiologically have fight or flight responses. Now, because even the most inexperienced first-year teacher knows that flight, running screaming out of the building at this moment, is not going to be viewed as particularly professional by my principal. Without even consciously realizing it, if we find ourselves threatened by a student's behavior, I'm supposed to make this kid work, I realize I can't make him, I reject flight without even consciously thinking about it, and what I am left with, without even being consciously aware of it, is what I'm left with is fight. And if I'm not careful, I can right at this moment in a traditional way try to make that kid do this work, which if what the kid wants is a power struggle, which usually if a kid says you can't make me, that kid wants a power struggle, I'm actually end up reinforcing that student. So we just have to be aware of that. And we have to, as Lori talked about in her session, we have to take care of ourselves, that when the cortisol floods in, when we move into those fight or flight responses, we have to take care of ourselves, and we consciously have to kind of bring ourselves down at that moment. Because if we don't, we end up having an overdependence upon punitive consequences. What can I do to make this kid do what I tell him to do? And the problem with that is, although corrective consequences are a vitally important part of what we do, they're actually the weakest of the behavioral strategies. They have the least probable success for the student, in part because even students at a relatively young age have realized there's not that much we can do to them on the punitive side. When we give it our best shot at implementing consequences, some percentage of our kids are going to go, so what? So what? So keep me in from recess. Shoot, I haven't had a recess in 3 years. What else are you going to do to me? Call my mommy. You think you're hearing bad language from me? Well, you wait until you get in touch with her. Secondary level, in-school suspension. Who cares? Big deal. Small room, my 9 closest friends, intimate setting. And our ultimate consequence, which is really kind of absurd, is out-of-school suspension. Really, schools are the only place that we give 3 days off for bad behavior. And if a student is not supervised in their home, what does the kid learn? Being 3 days off school is actually easier than being in school, and we've potentially lost them. So what I ask with this part of the introduction is that you just reflect on, we have no consequences that will make kids behave, and we need to avoid getting sucked into power struggles. And that leads me to setting up the rest of my talk, which is encouraging that we view misbehavior as a puzzle to be solved, not a threat that needs to be squashed or a behavior that needs to be eliminated. Rather, it's a puzzle. And certainly Lori and Margot and Lederic's work really set up for, we have to think about what might be going on with this student. What are the factors that are taking place? What's happened in this student's life, and so on. And then what I'm going to talk to you about with the remainder of my time is that the category of the puzzle pieces can be summarized by the acronym STOIC, which is structure for success. Teach expectations like a great basketball coach coaches a basketball team. Observe student behavior, supervise, monitor. While you're observing, interact positively with students, and correct fluently. And we'll be looking at each of those in some degree of depth. Just in concluding this introduction, though, STOIC does come out, obviously, to the acronym STOIC, and one definition of STOIC is someone who is respected and admired for patience and endurance in the face of adversity. And when it comes to dealing with misbehavior, those barriers to learning, we have to be patient, we have to endure, and we have to manipulate the puzzle pieces that are defined by this STOIC acronym. The first of which is structure for success. The concept of structuring for success, which is the first of these puzzle pieces, in my opinion, the world's premier example of recognizing the importance of structuring a setting for success is actually Disney World. If you think about what Disney World, or really any of the other theme parks that have emulated the work that Disney has done for over 5 decades, they charge people really a large amount of money, and everybody knows that the main thing you're going to be doing is standing in line. Now, I'm a fairly old guy. I went to Disneyland as an 11-year-old kid for 1 day, and this would have been 54 years ago. And they had long lines. They did not have the stanchions and theater ropes and other structural elements that they do with lines. Lines were 200 yards long, 8 to 12 people wide. Lines for different attractions in the early years of that theme park physically crossed each other. Now reflect on the way people do lines now, both in Disney, Six Flags, any of the other theme parks. Think about TSA in crowded airports. Think about even Department of Motor Vehicles. They use stanchions and theater ropes to make switchbacks, and just think about what that structural element does. First of all, it eliminates people cutting into your line. It creates faces on both sides of you as you're going through these switchbacks, and we literally are cognitively wired to have brain activation when we see faces. It's not entertainment seeing the back of the same people's heads for 20 minutes. It's this sea of faces on both sides. The switchbacks allow you to mark your progress. And I could go on with more examples of just the simple structural elements of long lines being managed with stanchions and theater ropes. It affects both your behavior in that setting, but it affects your attitude towards that setting because it makes the time go by quicker and all kinds of other elements. Now, what does any of this have to do with schools? Well, whether we're talking about school-wide, which is what I'm going to start with some examples in just a few minutes, or organizational elements within each of our individual classrooms, the way we organize the setting has a big impact on how children will behave, but also on how they feel about the setting. In the same way, like going to a well-structured restaurant, you don't notice the structure, you notice the quality of the food, you notice the enjoyable ambiance, and you enjoy the company that you're with. You go to a badly structured restaurant, and you resent that they lost your reservation, they make you wait way too long, they seat other people before you're seated, it's too crowded and people are bumping into you. If things are structured badly, you notice bad structure. So it's physical arrangements, scheduling issues, it's organizational patterns, it's our rituals and routines and procedures, school-wide and in each of our individual classrooms. It's also, do we have clear expectations for students, and have we designed very clear expectations for staff? Now, let me give you kind of a range of examples. Let's just take one. Many elementary school cafeterias have very, very bad acoustics. Now, if you're fortunate enough that you're in an elementary school that has maybe 150 to 250 kids in the cafeteria, but you have good acoustics, totally disregard this example. But if there's bad acoustics and you seat kids on both sides of those rectangular shaped tables, quite literally, the bad acoustics require that kids talk louder and louder and louder in order to talk to the kids across from them. If you change the way you structure your cafeteria environment, this example actually comes from Fresno, California. It's a large elementary school. They heard me talk about this example. They implemented. If you seat kids on only one side of the cafeteria tables, kids can still talk, but they can only talk to one or two kids seated near them, and they don't have the competition of 12 different tables and the noise across tables. This change in the structural element makes it easy for kids to exhibit the behavior that we've taught them, which is use a soft, quiet, conversational voice while you're socializing in the cafeteria. Now, again, if your cafeteria doesn't have a problem with a noise reverberating because of the bad acoustics, you wouldn't want to make this change because you never want to manipulate a puzzle piece to solve a problem that doesn't exist. You're manipulating puzzle pieces to try to solve problems that do exist. Here's another example. This is a secondary example. This comes from A&M Consolidated High School in College Station, Texas. They've done some great work on structural elements throughout their school. In fact, that district working with safe and civil schools. And we always use the STOIC framework, structure, teach, observe, interact, positively, correct, calmly, to improve your school in a continual basis. And they did really well with this. But one residual problem was actually some inconsistency amongst the staff. Some staff who want to use bring your own device curriculum. Hey, get your cell phones out and we're going to work on this. Here's the URL that you go to. Other teachers who don't do that really disliked kids having their devices. So here's the solution that they came up with, and I've shared this with many other schools since, and we really appreciate A&M Consolidated sharing this example. This is a large laminated poster that's required to be posted in every class. There's a movable clip. Teachers, where throughout the semester they're never going to use electronic devices, they put their clip on the first rectangle that you see there, which says electronic devices will not be used in class today, and they basically train the students. Third period, unless I have a stroke or an epiphany of some kind, I'm never going to be using electronic devices here in this particular class. So if I see one, I have to confiscate it. On the other hand, when kids go to fourth period, the teacher may be variable, and so the clip will move from day to day. Just with this structural element of creating clear messaging, a consistent place where kids will look to determine, am I going to be using an electronic device in this class period or aren't I? They reduce the problem of electronic devices by about 90%. Here's another example. This comes from another different Texas district. This is a district that has been implementing safe and civil schools for, probably about 18 years now. A-Leaf district outside of Houston, Texas. This is from a large ninth grade center, Hastings Ninth Grade Center. This visual that you see there is a little small poster that is outside every classroom. So as teachers are greeting kids at the door, if they see a dress code violation, they can just point over to this little prop of this poster. And this just prompts both teachers and kids, dress code is important. And what my text there says is, when expectations for any school-wide policy are undefined or unclear, behavior is going to be problematic, because you would be better off with no dress code at all in a school than a dress code that's enforced by 7 out of 10 of staff. And that is true for anything that should be school-wide. If it's enforced inconsistently by staff, we put kids in an unfair position. Now, let me give one classroom example. Homework. There's a couple of variables that an individual teacher can do that will have an impact on the number of kids who remember to bring their homework, and for any individual kid, the frequency with which that kid does remember to bring their homework. The first is just the regularity with which homework is assigned. And what I mean by that is trying to set up a regular pattern of homework. Both of my children went to public schools in Eugene, Oregon, graduated from public school in Eugene, Oregon. When they went to elementary, there was a 3rd, 4th, 5th grade team of teachers that had been teaming together for multiple years. And once you got in with the 3rd grade teacher, you had the team of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teacher for the next 3 years. And we were told as families, your child will have math homework for the next 3 years, every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and we'll never have math homework on a Thursday and Friday. There'll be a writing assignment assigned on Tuesday, due every Thursday. There'll be a spelling list, comes home on Monday. There'll be a test on that list on Friday. And just that regularity of the pattern made it so easy to help our children be responsible and for us as families to help monitor. Here's the second structural variable that an individual teacher can make, and that is physically collecting the homework from each student. Everybody, this is Thursday. Your writing assignment is due today. Put it on your desk. While you're working on the challenge problem that is on the board, I'm going to come around and collect your homework. And just that physical accountability of the teacher picking it up from every kid, thank you, thank you, thank you, and the kid knowing if I don't have it, that my teacher is going to know it immediately. It's not an issue of, oh gosh, I'm afraid of my teacher. It's just that direct feedback, either corrective or positive, is so powerful. Handing it into a box or a basket, that's a structural element that may be more time efficient, but you're going to get less homework in. So to wrap up this particular category of structuring for success, the more things we can do to manipulate the structure to prompt appropriate behavior, the better, which leads me to the second of the STOIC pieces, which is let's teach our expectations with great clarity. The T of the STOIC acronym is to make sure that we are teaching students to behave responsibly in every setting, all of our school-wide settings, and each of our different classroom settings, because in your classroom, you have different settings. Cooperative group is a different setting than is independent seat work, than is your whatever your bell ringer activity is, than is cleanup at the end. You actually want different bundles of responsible behavior in each of those settings. So with this T, let's start with one of the things that in our work with positive behavior support, which we've been doing since the mid-'80s, by the way, is we encourage that schools develop school-wide guidelines for success, which is 3 to 5 words or phrases that will quite literally become the spiritual core of our school. And let me give you some examples. This example comes from a wonderful high school in Bellevue, Washington, Interlake High School. And when they were doing this work with Safe and Civil, I believe we started with Bellevue in about the year 2005. The Interlake High School team worked with their staff, worked with their students, and worked with their parents. What do we want the spirit of Interlake to be? And they went through a range of activities, but they summarized what they came up with the three elegant words: integrity, humanity, scholarship. This many years later, this is still the theme of that school. And although there have been staff changes, even a change of principal, the core principles of what the school is have remained: integrity, humanity, scholarship. This is a district that just started working with us a few years ago, Navasota ISD. It's a single high school district in Texas. They came up with, for all of their schools, the district guidelines. Navasota ISD. Their guidelines are: never give up, interact positively, strive for success, do your best. This is the theme that our rules fit under, that our procedures fit under. This is another example from a high school. It takes pride to be successful. So part of our teaching of behavior has to be the big picture traits that the entire staff is so committed to that we will all be preaching, teaching, and inspiring these traits. Moving from that, we also need to teach and have lessons on common area expectations, our routines and our policies, hallway procedures, elementary playground procedures and policies and rules and expectations. A visual that I'm going to show you actually comes from a school in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, that as they were doing this work many, many years ago, they came up with expectations and a poster for the playground, expectations and a poster for cafeteria, for halls, etc. I just loved their restroom one. It's the most best task analysis of elementary restroom bathroom behavior that I've ever seen. Restrooms, what to do: go, flush, wash, leave. Clear, simple, easy to communicate, easy to remind students of. I shared this doing some work with some teams in Alabama this summer, and one of the staff members brought this to me that I'm going to show you next. And what I'm going to show you in just a moment is an expanded version of what you see above the urinal in the boys' bathroom. This is a rural Alabama school. How can someone who can hit a deer at 250 yards keep missing the urinal? Aim, boys, you can do it. The teacher who shared this with me said that their maintenance person came up with this and that he said it really made a big difference. So clear expectations directly taught to kids. Continuing on with this, we also need lessons on classroom expectations, routines, and policies. And please be careful not to misunderstand this next statement, because it's not a criticism of any of you as a teacher. It is inescapable because of your role as a teacher. Your room is very complicated. I don't care whether you teach pre-K. I don't care whether you teach children in a learning center, children with learning disabilities. I don't care whether you teach a gen ed fourth grade room, or I don't care if you teach high school physics. Your room is a very complicated mix of rituals, procedures, traditions, expectations, and you have to teach kids all of the details of that. Those of you who know some of my work know that I do have a classroom management book called Champs, which actually is organized around the STOIC framework. But within the T of STOIC, there's several chapters about teaching our expectations, and it talks about that for every different activity, cooperative groups are different from a test, which is different from bell ringer, which is different from teacher-directed instruction, which is different from a lab activity. We need to teach kids conversation. Who can you talk to about what, how loud, how often, how long, where, and so on. Help, how do you get questions answered, and how do you get my attention as the teacher? What's the activity itself? Movement. Can you get up and sharpen a pencil? Can you go get a drink? Can you leave the cooperative group to go turn in a piece of paper? And what does active participation look like and sound like? It does come out to the acronym CHANCE, which is just a mnemonic for helping teachers plan, and we have some worksheets for planning to ensure that you have no hidden norms. Now, let me clarify what I mean by the concept of a hidden norm with a non-school-based example. My job for actually many decades now as a staff developer involves my traveling a lot. I know that when I go from airport to airport, most of the really large airports are actually very, very alike, comparing themselves to each other. But as soon as you start going to smaller airports where the equipment that they have, the staffing patterns that they have, smaller airports, even mid-sized airports in a community like my home in Eugene, Oregon, you compare Eugene, Oregon to another mid-sized airport anywhere, their procedures are going to be different. And they're a little bit of hidden norms. There's a few airports that post their expectations really well, so while you're standing in line, by the time you get up to the end of the line, you know exactly what they want. Other airports post nothing, and you just have to sort of guess. And I'm going to use this as an example when I'm on the C for correct of our STOIC acronym. Because it's a hidden norm, do you take your shoes off or don't you? If you have to take them off, do you put them in a bin or don't you put them in a bin? If those things weren't posted, those are hidden norms, where as a traveler you have to guess. Now, I'm going to talk about that example more later, but for now, while we're on the T of the STOIC acronym, kids should never have to guess about, for you as a teacher, is it okay for me to get up and sharpen my pencil or not? And do I need your permission or not? That should be overtly clear. We have implemented this model in big cities like Chicago, mid-sized cities like Wichita, Kansas, and tiny little communities like the one you see the picture of here, Shungnak, Alaska. Northwest Arctic Borough District adopted CHAMPS in our STOIC framework a number of years ago. And by eliminating the hidden norms, they have created a great level of affinity between the community and the school, where before they had such antagonism between the community and the school personnel that their teacher turnover was high. The amount of antipathy in this very small community between the school and the community was awful. That's all gone. And this is done with brilliant leadership at the district level and also at the building level, and a wonderful staff. But one thing they were still struggling with a little bit was kids, whenever they would hear the mail plane arrive in this very remote, isolated village, kids would run out of school to go see family gotten a letter or a package. It was these kids who told Roger Franklin, Mr. Franklin, we ought to champ the post office. Roger said that's a great idea. They actually, with the postmaster, some village elders, Roger Franklin, the principal, and these young students, they developed community norms for the post office, because there should never be any hidden norms anywhere. We should teach kids exactly and precisely what we want them to know about every single setting. And just this notion, as I'm heading towards wrapping up this topic, realize your school is this extremely complex mix of school-wide expectations and an extremely complex mix of classroom expectations. And if you are secondary teacher, middle school or high school, you need to realize that some behaviors that may annoy you in your fifth period class are actually behaviors that are not only tolerated, they are perhaps encouraged and reinforced because the style and structure of the teacher that some of your children had in fourth period, 5 minutes before they come in your room, are different expectations than yours. And you elementary teachers, you need to realize that some of the behaviors that annoy you are behaviors that the kids spent a year with a teacher the year before that were tolerated, perhaps encouraged, perhaps even reinforced. So at the beginning of the year, we have to teach our expectations with precision. Elementaries and secondaries, you have to reteach them minimally throughout the first week of school. You're going to have to bring it back before and after major vacations. You're going to have to bring it back during times of high stress like the holiday season. And I want to go back to some of the things that Lori and Margot and Laderick talked about. The holiday season for children with dysfunction in their homes are an agonizing time period. And you know what children need at school? They need more stability. You know how you recreate more stability? Periodically reteach your expectations. You also should do this through at least once a week throughout the last month of school as kids are beginning to wind down and they think we no longer have structure anymore. And any day that things did not go well in cooperative groups on a Tuesday, on Wednesday, before you put them in cooperative groups, you should reteach and re-inspire your expectations. So to cap off this teach piece, and to go on to the O piece that we'll get to in just a moment, you're going to teach like a basketball coach does, which means with clarity, with repetition as necessary, and with inspiration. We can do this. Observe student behavior, which involves supervising and monitoring with precision. Without monitoring, even adults will push the limits. This is not just something with students. And I want to begin on this one with looking at two examples of adult behavior. Everybody who's listening to this, I want you to think about what your behavior would be in the circumstance that I'm going to describe. I live in Eugene, Oregon. I drive frequently between Eugene and Portland and have throughout my entire driving life. And most of that stretch of road is 65 miles per hour. And although at peak traffic times it may not be possible, most times when I'm driving that stretch of road, there is usually an open lane. I am totally aware the speed limit is 65. I'm fully aware of the rules. I'm fully aware of the benefits of going 65 or less in terms of my safety, in terms of my pocketbook, in terms of my concern about the environment. But if there's an open lane and there's no ice on the road, I, Randy Sprick, tend not to be driving 65. And in fact, I can even identify sort of a default number. And it's in excess of 65 that I'm probably traveling. I ask everybody who's listening to this, what is your default number? Completely open lane, no ice on the road. It's a 4, 6, or 8 lane road. It's a road that you know well. There's no blind corners or risk of a huge pothole coming up. What are you probably traveling? Now, let me tell you what I do when I do this with live audiences. I frequently, just last week I was in a state and I had about 400 people in an auditorium, one wonderful opportunity. I asked people this and I had them share with a partner, what are you traveling? I then said, I promise I'm not going to embarrass you. If you were 65 or less, I won't embarrass you. If you are 66 or more, I'm not going to embarrass you. But how many of you in this room told your colleague a number that was 66 or more? Please raise your hand and keep it up. Whether I do this in Kansas, whether I do it in Illinois, whether I do it in Washington, usually somewhere around 95 people will raise their hand. 95% of us are driving in excess of the rules, of what we know the rules to be. Now, there's a bit of irony here. And that is in schools, we're the rule enforcers, and we can get a little bit agitated that kids know that they're not supposed to run in the halls, but they run in the halls sometimes. Well, why? Because part of human nature is to break the rules. I'm not saying you tolerate. I'm not saying you allow it. In fact, when we get the C to correct of this STOIC acronym, I'm going to say you should relentlessly correct. But what I do want to make the point of is every one of you who said something or thought something in excess of 66, mine would be about probably 76, if there is a police officer in front of us, beside us, or behind us, what does every single one of us start traveling? 65. The presence of authority prompts those of us who are fairly law-abiding, responsible people to do better at following the rules. But there's another dynamic with this, and the other dynamic is my wife and I are pretty decent housekeepers, but our house is actually the least cluttered at one particular minute in time. And this actually has very little to do with whether you as a family have the luxury of sometimes having occasional housekeeping help. It actually has to do with most of us, our house is the least cluttered in the 60 seconds right before company arrives. And this has nothing to do with rules or authority. It has to do with if people we care about are coming over for dinner until company arrives, oh, let's get some of those papers off the counter. Close up the laptop. That doesn't have to be sitting there. And it's not frantic and it's not a fear of authority. It's just most of us as human beings with people we like and would respect want to put our best foot forward. We as educators should be capitalizing on both of those. We are in fact the authority who's going to enforce the rules. But if we build relationships with kids, we're also companies coming over and they want to show us our best, which is in the classroom why this involves circulating and scanning. Which is in the common areas, require that we organize supervision so that we have enough adults present, that the adults are modeling friendly, respectful behavior as they're supervising, that adults are coordinating with each other so that we have particular zones and we're noticing if another adult in another zone needs help that we'll move over towards them, and that students receive very consistent information from us. But in addition to our being there, in addition to our interacting positively with kids, which is what I'll get to next, and correcting every single misbehavior that we'll see, another part of the teacher's role is to use data to view long-term trends. Now, I know this is a place that whether you're gen ed or special ed, that I may risk losing. Oh yeah, data collection, we have to do it because our supervisors tell us we have to do it. Well, let me give you a very clear and compelling reason why we need to use data. This is an example from a class I had an opportunity to teach many, many years ago. This was a general education kindergarten teacher, and the project that I assigned to all of my students, all of whom are either teachers, counselors, or administrators, is you need to identify a behavior now, and when you come back here a week from now, I want a week of baseline data of either a frequency count of the disruptions or arguing or whatever that a kid does, or if you're concerned about a kid, for example, who refuses to participate or follow directions, which is what this kid is, you keep a stopwatch in your pocket or around your neck, and every time the kid checks out and stops being on task, you click the start button, you let it run until he's doing what he should be doing. You then click the stop button, but then when he checks out again and is not doing what you want, you click the start button. And what you'll see from this chart is this kid had very stable baseline data of about 2 hours of refuse, I'm not going to do this, this is stupid, and then being off task or not being part of the class. I observed the teacher. This is a wonderful teacher. This is a very reinforcing teacher. And my only very minor criticism of her was that with this kid who had her so concerned, she's paying too much attention to him. Ricky, you'll like this one. Come on, buddy. This will be fun. Come on, join us. And I suggested that she just implement planned ignoring. Reinforce the heck out of Ricky and give him lavish attention when he's doing what you want. And when he's not, pretend like he's not there. And you can see the behavior got worse for a little while. And then over the course of about 40 days of instruction of the just planned ignoring intervention and just blitzing him on positive, we ended up with some days of 100% participation and then some ups and downs from there. But the main thing I want you with me on is please look at this slide now, which is the same data, but I'm showing you only 11 days of intervention. And I share this one with you because imagine that this teacher didn't have this chart. Let's say she told me about this kid and I said, well, you know, from what you're telling me about Ricky, I think you ought to try planned ignoring. And let's say she implements, but then 2 weeks later, I say to her, and remember, if she doesn't have this chart, and I say to her, how's it going with Ricky? If she doesn't have this on a chart and she sees, we have a 25% improvement in only a little over 2 weeks. Without a chart, what is this teacher going to tell me? She's going to say, Randy, it's not working at all. And why is she going to say that? Because the difference between 90 minutes of off-task refusal to follow and participate, no classroom teacher, gen ed or special ed, will be able to perceive the difference between that and 120 minutes. But with this chart, do you know what I'm saying to this teacher and what she's saying to herself? This intervention is working exactly as it should. So we need to observe because we're the person in authority. We need to observe because we're the companies coming over. And for our chronic situations, we need data to observe trends and patterns. largely because without data, we can throw out largely successful interventions. Where we're going to go next is the I of this STOIC acronym, that when we're observing, we need to work very actively to interact positively with students. I want to actually break that down and articulate that a huge part of building relationships with kids, we can actually operationalize. And so I want to operationalize it as 4 different skills that we as educators should consciously manipulate. Just interacting in a welcoming manner with every student, saying hello, getting to know students' names, students perhaps who are from other cultures than our own, making an effort to pronounce their name correctly and not worrying that I'm pronouncing it badly, and asking that child to help me across time to learn to pronounce it. Just shows such a sign of respect and such a sign of I'm aware of you as an individual. Showing an interest in students as time permits, listening to them. For you elementaries, this is, of course, greeting your students at the door as they're entering, or greeting them as they're getting off the bus and as you're preparing to escort them. For you as secondary teachers, this is as much as you can for each of the different class periods that you teach, greeting every student as they come in. Some of you at secondary level see 180 kids a day, but there are teachers who make an effort by day 3 to know every single student by name. You as secondary teachers, I'll tell you something that I want you to be very, very conscious of. If you see 180 kids a day, your most average students can kind of fade into the woodwork. And I'm talking about your students who are average in every capacity. They're average socially, they're average academically, they're average in their physical appearance, they're average in their clothing, they're average in how they carry themselves. Those students in particular make a conscious effort to get to know, because I think there are some kids in some schools that go days or perhaps even weeks and no adults even notice them. That's a shame. My kids went to an elementary school, as I mentioned before. There was a fair-sized school, but there was a paraprofessional at that school who, anytime the kids were absent, she actually went up to them and said, "Jessica, you were absent yesterday. This school's not as good a place when you're not here." When I realized this was really a very conscious pattern, because I talked to some of our neighbors, she did this with every kid. I said, "This is really brilliant, Martha. How do you keep track of who is absent?" She said, "I cheat." I said, "What do you mean you cheat?" She said, "Well, I take Wednesday's absentee list and I keep it for Thursday. And I keep it for Thursday so that before I go out to the playground or the cafeteria, I look at the kids who are absent the day before, and I just make a note to go up to those students." And when I mentioned what a brilliant procedure that was to this paraprofessional, she said, "Well, I don't just do it with Matt and Jess." I said, "Oh, I know, Martha. It'd be kind of creepy if you did." And she laughed, and we went on, and that's when she explained how she used the absentee list. And I said to her, "You use that line, 'This school's not as good a place when you're not here.'" And I actually shared with her this quote that you see on the screen, which is, "Treat people as if they were what they ought to be, and you help them become what they're capable of being." This is from the German poet-philosopher Goethe. It's a brilliant summary. We need to treat every student as if they're highly valued. The second of these skills is we need to provide age-appropriate, non-embarrassing positive feedback. And our positive feedback should be specific and descriptive, and you should also be comfortable with your own style. If you're effervescent, your feedback's going to be effervescent. If you're businesslike, your feedback is going to be businesslike. You don't need a personality transplant on any part of this interact positively. Do it in a way that fits your style. But children need feedback on both their behavioral and academic efforts, and when we're giving them that feedback, the feedback should be specific and descriptive. The third of these skills is use extrinsic rewards when you need to boost motivation. Now, I'm not saying you should use extrinsic rewards. If you can motivate kids with "Good morning, it's nice to see you," and utilizing their names, building a relationship, and giving them meaningful, age-appropriate, positive feedback, use that. But if you need to boost it into gear, either with an individual kid or with a class, setting up extrinsic rewards is not bribery. A bribe is an incentive to do something illegal, unethical, or immoral. And if putting a kid on a contract that leads to points, which when he gets X number of points, he earns some rewards, is analogous to anything, it's analogous to university. University is a giant token economy. You do these things to earn these points, which when you do, you get the extrinsic reward of a diploma, which allows you to open doors that would otherwise be closed to you. But shouldn't students work without needing all these rewards? Of course they should, but shouldn't we also have self-washable laundry? And as from the other presenters and myself, if you have a student who has a past history of complex trauma, if you have a student with a history of disabilities, either hidden or identified, if you have a student who has just failed to thrive in school and see the benefits of work that comes, if we need to set up an extrinsic reward because of those disadvantages that a student brings to the school picture, I have no hesitation in doing so, in the same way that a university has no hesitation at setting up an extrinsic reward of a diploma to get you to play the college game. But won't the other students think that this is unfair? And my response to that one is, possibly, but if you have a really rich array of good morning, it's nice to see you, and a very, very rich array of behaviorally specific praise for both academic and behavioral performance, it's actually not all that likely. And so I think that one is a little bit overblown. And then the fourth of these skills is the sum total of everything that I'm doing in terms of non-contingent attention, specific praise, and if I'm using extrinsics, points, tokens, economies, etc., the sum total of those should exceed by a factor of 3 every time I have to correct misbehavior. In other words, using my attention strategically to shape behavior. This is a concept that was coined as the criticism trap clear back in the 1960s, by the person that was one of the people who was hugely influential in my work and my career, Dr. Wesley C. Becker. He coined the phrase the criticism trap because he identified that all too often teachers think they're punishing behavior. Jamal, you need to go back to your seat. When in fact, if a student is starved for attention and that's the easiest way to get attention, I may in fact be reinforcing misbehavior. Now, where we're going to head in just a few moments is the C for correct. I am not advocating that you ignore all misbehavior by any stretch of the imagination. But what I am saying is, for every time we have to correct an individual, we should kind of gently and mentally tell ourselves, I owe this student 3. Because the research literature says, if I'm not careful, I will actually do 3 to 15 times more. Get back in your seat. Keep your hands to yourself. Now is not the time to be talking about that. You need to be talking about the science lab that you're working on. We do 3 to 15 times more of that than we do, good morning, it's nice to see you, and, hey, Jamal, you're doing a real fine job of staying on task. And if that ratio gets skewed, here is what I inadvertently communicate to my students. If you do what I want, there is a huge risk that I will not notice that you're in the room here today. But if you annoy me, I'll be right there for you every 3.5 to 4 minutes. And so this one is a mechanism. Here's an assignment. Once a month, identify 30 minutes out of your day that you tend to be naggy. Audio record that time period. And then go home that night and sit down with a recording device, which any smartphone works for you for this, and do a count. Every time I pay attention to misbehavior, make a mark in a corrective column. Every time I pay attention to positive behavior, make a mark in the positive behavior column. And you will see how you are distributing the most valuable reward your children have access to, which is not points, stickers, and free time and other extrinsics. It's you, the teacher, looking at me. It's you, the teacher, talking to me. Do that 3 times more often when I'm doing what you want than when I'm violating what you want. Where we'll head next within this STOIC acronym is correcting fluently. What you use to correct misbehavior is actually far less critical than that you do something, that you do in fact correct. And the C of this STOIC acronym is not just correct, but correct fluently. Now here's what I mean by correct fluently. Sometimes the disruption that a student's behavior might cause, and let's make this teacher-directed instruction. I, Randy, am the teacher. I'm presenting a lesson. I have a student exhibit a disruptive behavior of some kind. It is very possible that what I do next actually is even more disruptive to the flow of instruction than what the student did. So whatever I do to correct should, as much as possible, feel almost like a parenthetical phrase within the flow of the momentum of what I'm doing in the classroom. So that it's whatever I'm doing. I'm teaching, and let's say it's teacher-directed instruction, and it's a flow, and I'm asking students questions and so on. I have a disruptive behavior. If I don't have a plan, it would just be, Ellen, that was disruptive. Please keep your hands still if you would. Now, class, what I was saying was, as compared to, Alan, you need to keep your hands still. That is not acceptable. It's distracting to me. It is bothering other people. Because then my correction is even more interrupting of the flow. So within this section, I want to talk about these bullet points that you see here. And then with a little bit of time that we have remaining, I'll give you some examples of types of corrections. It's not an exhaustive list, but certainly in my materials, there's menus and descriptions of corrections. Any good behavior management or classroom management book has a range of the things that have been shown to be effective in the research literature. But again, what I do matters less than that I do something consistently. And the first of those considerations is the milder the consequence is, the more consistent I'm likely to be. Those of you who are in the classroom, ask yourself if you've used this phrase in the last month. Now, Maria, Tim, Ben, Habib, Susanna, any name. Now, Maria, stop that because I don't want to have to, whatever your corrective consequence is. If you have to pause, and some days you implement and other days, now stop that because I don't want to have to. Inadvertently, what you've set up is an intermittent reinforcement schedule where the kid gets away with it sometime. You want consequences that are so mild, you quite literally almost don't have to think about it. Maria, that's disruptive. A minute after class. Now, class, what I was saying was. And don't get hung up on the minute after class. We'll talk about that as one possible consequence, or even 5 seconds after class. But mainly, you should be fluent. You will only be fluent if you have a good menu of mild consequences. You have to be calm. Now, do you always have to be calm? No, as a one-time thing, if in mid-November a behavior of the class upsets you, letting the students know that you're upset. You treated that guest speaker in a very rude way. Go ahead and be as uncalm as you want to be as long as you don't belittle kids. But for the first 6 weeks of school, and for any behavior that becomes chronic, you need to be emotionally neutral. Here's the behavior, here's the cost, move on. Because with some kids, the biggest reward they have access to is to be able to control an adult's emotion. This is true for some 5-year-olds. It's true for some 17-year-olds. And an emotional reaction, if that's what a child wants, an emotional reaction is like paying the child $50 to exhibit the misbehavior. You need to be consistent. Your gravest risk to consistency is not your bad days. Most of us think, oh yeah, I know I'm not as consistent as I should be because some days I'm just tired and I'm impatient. I think you're very consistent on those days. Your grave risk to consistency is your good days. It's Monday, you're relaxed, you're refreshed. Yeah, you had a wonderful weekend. Kids are paying attention. They're laughing at your jokes. Adam is a jerk. You don't give a rip, so you go on with your lesson. But if you let him get by with it on Monday, you gently correct him for it on Tuesday. You harshly correct him for it on Wednesday. What's he got to do to you on Thursday? He's got to test you because you become interesting and fun to watch. The next of these bullet points is be brief, don't talk too much. And then the last, but truly most important of these bullet points is my correction has to be respectful. It has to be respectful because in our work, Safe and Civil Schools, and we get to do longitudinal work with school districts all around the nation to work on school-wide improvement, classroom management, and interventions for individual students. The only absolute rule that we give, and we remind people of it fairly frequently, the only absolute rule is belittlement of children by adults must be gone from our system. And certainly the wonderful work that Lori talked with us about and that Margot and Lederick talked about fit in with this. Harsh corrections, certainly belittling corrections, are truly potentially damaging. Now, let me put all of these together with an example that I previewed for you earlier. I travel way too much. I went through security in my home at Eugene, Oregon. I flew to Community B. I worked in Community B and went to mid-sized airport that afternoon in Community B to fly to Community C, where I was going to work the next day. When I did what I did in Eugene, Oregon, which is I took my shoes off, I put my shoes on the belt, and when I did that in Community B, a TSA employee with a perfect, what I'm going to refer to as a one-liner correction that you see on the screen now, just very respectfully said, please put your shoes in a bin. I grabbed a bin, I took my shoes off the belt, I put my shoes in the bin, I went through security, didn't think anything about it because this one-liner was so brief, it was so mild, it was clearly so part of what they do at this airport. I followed the instruction and I went on. I flew to Community C. I worked 2 days in Community C, and when I left that afternoon from the work that I was doing and went to the airport in Community C, I got to security. I grabbed a bin. I put my shoes in the bin as I had been instructed and just gently and professionally instructed to do. I put my shoes in a bin, and a TSA employee, and I really don't think I'm overly exaggerating this, in a booming public voice said, "Don't put your shoes in a bin." Now, I have enough social emotional regulation to know that I want to get home and that if I make an issue of this, I may be taken to some room or taken to the floor because they have the ability and the authority to do that if they wish to, if I handle this badly. So I sucked it up and I said nothing. I went through security, but as I was walking down the concourse to go to be in the gate area to catch my plane, I was looking over my own shoulder, and this was probably 5 years ago, so I was 60 at the time. And I was surprised to be looking over my own shoulder how angry I was at the treatment that I just received. Now, this was only literally 1 to 2 seconds. Don't put your shoes in a bin. But what am I getting at here? First of all, there was a hidden norm in that airport. I followed the norm that I had been instructed in the most recent airport. And when I was corrected, in a way that was both emotional and, in my opinion, disrespectful, because the tone of voice, "Don't put your shoes in a bin," implies, and you're an idiot for not knowing how we do it here at Airport C. That implication, you're an idiot because you don't know how we do it, literally made me angry at that airport. I'm thinking, this place, I feel anger, I feel hostility. It drove me emotionally away from those people in authority. So what's the point here? Our effective corrections should be always done respectfully. They should not make a big deal of things. They should never imply you're an idiot for not knowing the way I do it in my classroom. Now, what are just a couple of examples? A one-liner correction. Most misbehavior in the halls, let me use a secondary example. If you have enough adults helping supervise the halls, 2 out of 3 adults are standing in the doors. We have security, we have administrators. Everybody is helping supervise, and everybody's building relationships. Hey, Amalio, nice to see you today. Susan, see you later this afternoon. Tim, enjoyed having you in class. Haven't seen you in class last year. How's your year going? Cool. But we also then have one-liner corrections. Adam, you need to walk. Tim, Ben, keep your hands to yourself. Please honor our policies about hallway safety. If we relentlessly use one-liner corrections, it's like having a police officer posted every mile on the highway who, if we speed, pulls us over and says, "You need to slow down." we would follow the limits. Keeping a record of the behavior, that's the data collection piece that is within the O for observe. Any chronic misbehavior that's been going on for 2 to 3 weeks, start keeping a record, put it on a chart. Student runs in the hall, have them go back and walk. Assigning a timeout in the hall. Adam, I've spoken to you about this a couple of times. If you run, it slows you down because you need to stop and wait right there for 30 seconds. In the classroom, planned ignoring. I never ignore spur of the moment, but if a kid wants attention, I will set up a plan for planned ignoring, and I will tell him, Eric, from here on out, anytime you exhibit this kind of disruption, I'm going to pretend like I don't see you or hear you. And even just something as simple as time owed, which can be 5 seconds after class in a secondary school or 30 seconds off of a recess in an elementary. Okay, let me head to some concluding comments here so that then, if you're interested, you can add to the questions that have been being asked. STOIC are the puzzle pieces. They're the variables that we manipulate within our classroom. They're the variables that we as a staff need to manipulate collectively for the common areas and the common spirit of our school. Structure, teach, and observe are the preventative pieces. Interact positively is the positive piece. And of course, correcting fluently is the reactive piece. Let me end with one final quote, which is from former Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. The measure of success is not whether we have a tough problem to deal with, but whether it's the same problem you had last year. We want to manipulate these puzzle pieces in order to get better at both managing and preventing misbehavior, but building relationships with kids that motivate every kid in our school, regardless of their background, to thrive and do their very, very best every single day. And with that, let me turn it over to Clay, who's going to manage the Q&A with the time that we have remaining.
As a parent, I'm resisting the temptation to just ask you questions about what to do with my kids at home. We'll save that for later. So you got the questions pouring in. Well over 1,000 people in here right now. I think we're all delighted to be learning from you. First question up from a listener. What advice do you have for using behavior intervention specialists to build the skills of general educators as opposed to them taking on the role of a quote-unquote firefighter?
Great question, and I'm actually going to broaden it out just a little bit, Clay. I think a behavior intervention specialist, a dean of students, if you have such a person in your school, assistant principal, anybody who ends up feeling deluged with putting out fires, having to respond immediately to misbehavior, you should be looking at the trends and patterns of the types of behavioral fires that you're having to put out, and that should be a guide to staff development, things that we need to empower our staff with to try to prevent those misbehaviors. And again, here's where the STOIC framework comes in. How can we structure for success to reduce those behaviors? How can we design age-appropriate lessons, even with individual kids, or with entire classes or an entire student body to address those problems? And then likewise, the O, the I, and the C. In other words, let's empower staff with preventative and positive strategies for reducing the likelihood that we create or have to respond to those fires.
That's great. Could you be a little more specific about how you would develop your staff? Are there any resources or suggestions that you have? If I'm someone sitting in a special education director's chair, for instance, and I say, Randy, that makes a lot of sense, but what do I actually do? What would my next step be?
Yeah, again, great question, Clay. And the first part of my answer is going to be very self-serving because it is what we do at Safe and Civil Schools, is we work with school districts and or individual schools on either the classroom management level or the school-wide discipline level or Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions for individual students. Staff development is what we do. Also, though, within your state, you probably have some PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention and Support, coordinators or people at the state who could provide in-service opportunities. There's quite possibly, if you're in a district that is served by a special ed co-op or a regional service center, educational service district, et cetera, they probably have players who could help you. So basically looking at what are the ranges of options that we have for staff development within our school or our district. But don't just throw training at people either. It should be a comprehensive plan for how can we increase the degree to which our staff can manage these puzzle pieces. And although Safe and Civil, we actually use the acronym STOIC within all that we do. PBIS framework or your State Department may not use the acronym STOIC, but all of the strategies that I did brief pictures of previously within the last hour, they're all just types of things that are available and have been for many years in the research literature. So just look at what your options are for having somebody help guide you in staff development, in empowering people with more and more strategies.
Great. Let's talk about the ages that we can use the STOIC framework for. Does it go down to pre-K, and is there a sweet spot for this?
Actually, there is no sweet spot, and your lovely compliment about thinking about this at home. It's really any age level. Any organization should be asking, are we structuring for success for our customers? At the pre-K level, it's absolutely applicable. Anybody who travels on an airplane would be able to relate to this. If you see parents getting on with kids, and you realize they're going to be seated near you, the first thing I look for is, did they bring some stuff for the kids to play with? Did they bring some books for the kids to look at? Did they bring some puzzles for the kids to play with? Because that's an example of structuring for this time that a child is going to be on an airplane. If a parent doesn't bring anything, and especially if that's a very, very young child, if it's going to be a 5-hour across-the-country flight and they haven't brought anything for the child, you can just predict this child is going to have some behavioral problems and meltdowns that the families are going to have to deal with because they didn't structure for things. Within Safe and Civil Schools, we get to work with school districts where we do work with everybody, pre-K through high school level, and the framework is absolutely applicable. The types of structures and behaviors you're working with at high school level are different than they are at pre-K, but the problem-solving framework really works very, very well regardless of the age level of students that we're working with.
So let's say I'm a special education director or a special education teacher, or I'm someone and I'm really rolling out this STOIC framework. How long is it going to take me to see results?
Depends on what we're working on and how. Can be very immediate, like just making that change that I used in the opening where I started talking about structure. If you've got a real noisy cafeteria and you can change to kids seated on only one half of the cafeteria tables, that literally is within the first day. You're going, oh my goodness, this is remarkable. Other things can take a little bit more time, but we have some procedures called Start on Time within the work that we do, which is just for secondary schools. And it takes longer to set up because it really takes some planning on the part of the staff. But once it's implemented, we have had schools that have immediately made 80 to 90% reductions in tardiness. So it depends on the nature of the problem. If we're talking about a child with a very severe misbehavior that has been going on for years, there it's unlikely that you're going to see results immediately. You're going to see that kind of gradual reduction that I showed in that chart that went from 120 minutes of off-task to, it took 45 days to get to the first day of 100% on-task behavior. But you'll usually start seeing progress within about 2 weeks if you have found a set of interventions, again, the STOIC framework, we want to be addressing all 5 of those puzzle pieces, but you should, even for an intractable, difficult problem, you should start, if it's going to be effective, you should start seeing progress within about 2 weeks.
Gotcha. And you started to talk about this a little bit in the context of professional development options out there for the staff. But it'd be really helpful for me, at least, and I think for the listeners as well, if you could help us understand how the STOIC framework differs from other PBIS programs, and whether it dovetails with PBIS and other approaches, or does it replace them?
The dovetails is the short answer to the question. Within my work, we do call ourselves positive behavior support because we're just based on the over 100 years of research in behavioral psychology and 50 years of research in good classroom management and 30 years of good research in school-wide approaches. The school-wide portion of my work, though, is titled Foundations because a good approach to behavior support lays the foundation for everything else that you're doing in your school. In other words, let's take some different approaches, like Michelle Garcia Winter's The Social Thinking Curriculum, Ross Green's work, PBIS, Guy and Horner's work. All of that really, all of them fit within the same philosophical and research-based framework. Some pieces, though, like the social thinking curriculum, that would fit more within the T of the STOIC acronym within our framework because it's looking at what can we teach kids. Likewise, a wonderful social skills curriculum like Second Steps, Committee for Children out of Seattle. We work with lots of districts that are implementing the Second Steps curriculum, which is trying to provide lessons for kids about social, emotional, behavioral health. It fits very, very well with the T of STOIC, but it doesn't really address looking at staff behavior. So we work a lot with school districts that are implementing Second Step, and we have a great relationship with the developers and implementers of Second Step because they recognize they're looking at what can we teach kids. Our work is looking more at what can we teach the adults about how to both structure the environment, supervise the environment, et cetera, so that kids can actually apply the positive behaviors that we're teaching them.
Gotcha. So let's talk about high school students. How would you use STOIC with high school students whose behavior is interfering with teaching and learning?
Again, great question, and forgive the initial part being self-serving, but within our work, I have a book that's actually published by Jossie Bass, and then we also distribute it through Safe and Civil, but it's called Discipline in the Secondary Classroom, and the first edition of that book I wrote in 1984, and it was published in 1985. We're now up to the third edition of that book based upon what we've learned in implementing it in thousands of high schools across the nation. That book is actually organized around the STOIC framework. So the first chapters are all about how do you structure the classroom for success. And just one quick example of that is you as a classroom teacher never want to just give straight lecture. You have to have within a 50-minute class period, and even more importantly within a 90-minute class period, you need change-ups of activity every 15 minutes or so that we're going from teacher-directed, that is not just lecture, but is actually actively involving kids, good explicit instruction. Everybody stand up if you believe this statement to be true. Stay seated if you believe it to be false. Be prepared to justify your answer. The statement is blah, 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 blah. Stand up or sit down. Be prepared to, so that you're keeping kids actively involved. 15 minutes later, you shift from that teacher-directed mode to a cooperative group activity. You come back for another 10 minutes of teacher-directed to then give an independent task or a short quiz or whatever. And that's just one, again, of scores of examples that are just within the structure portion of the work that we have. On the teach portion, we actually have age-appropriate lessons for how you apply the CHAMPS acronym I just got from some colleagues in Ventura County, California, who've been implementing my work. CHAMP's Expectations for Socratic Seminar. In other words, in our high school class, if we're using Socratic methodology, how do we structure that so that we overtly teach kids how to behave successfully during the activity structure called Socratic Seminar? So it really is all just, it's completely applicable. You just have to make it age appropriate for the kids.
Got it. What extrinsic rewards work best?
Great question. And again, let me reiterate something that I said within the last hour. If you can get by without needing extrinsic rewards, do so, because we should neither be implementing extrinsics nor avoiding extrinsics because of some kind of philosophical affinity for them or some kind of philosophical aversion. There is a huge amount of research literature that says if we are being unsuccessful in motivating kids with less intrusive methodology, because extrinsic rewards are fairly intrusive methodology. If we can motivate kids without needing to go to that level of intrusiveness, do so, because they take instructional time to manage. But if I need to utilize either with a whole class, with a subgroup of a class, or with an individual student in a class, if I do need to go to extrinsic rewards, let's not hesitate to do so. In terms of choosing rewards, we have to recognize what is rewarding to one individual may not be rewarding to another. But a couple of rules of thumb. You want to be as simple as possible. Here's a quick example that I just learned yesterday. Some schools that were doing some of the work that we recommend on improving attendance in the school. Two of the schools in this district developed an inter-school competition, School A competing against School B, to try to raise average daily attendance over the period of, I believe, a semester. And whichever school won, the other school had to wear the winning school's colors and have a picture taken. Both schools, one of them did in fact win, but both schools raised average daily attendance by 2 percentage points. Now think about that for a minute. The only reward was the winning team gets a picture of the other school wearing their colors for a day, and both schools raised average daily attendance from like 92% to 94%. That's a huge behavioral change that can make a difference in the lives of kids. When it comes to individuals choosing rewards, look at what the kid chooses to do. Is he more isolated or is he more social? If he's more isolated, whatever rewards I might experiment with or ask him if he would like to work towards should be more isolated. Do you want some time on the computer? Would you like time to take a walk around the track by yourself? If what the kid does on his own time is more social, I would choose more, hey, would you like to work for this or this or this that might involve doing something with a peer or a friend? In looking at the kid, if the misbehavior is hugely attention-seeking, what if I lay out a reward of getting to spend some time with me or getting to spend some time 5 minutes with the principal or whatever? So look at what the kid does and let that be a guide to the range of rewards that you might consider exploring. And always try to go initially with as small a reward as you think might be possible to motivate the student, because it'll be easier to fade than if I go to a much more powerful reward or expensive reward than I might have otherwise needed to go to.
Great. I think we may only have time for one more question. Let's go to this one. Are there special techniques that are especially effective for helping students in poverty? Great listener question there.
The short answer, and then I'll be a bit more long-winded because I know we have a few minutes for this, and it's such an important question. The short answer is with children of poverty or any other challenge that some other children may not be facing, we just have to do this work even better. And whether it's a child who, because of poverty, has acute childhood trauma, children of poverty are more likely to have a higher ACEs score, acute trauma score, meaning that they've been faced with more frequent moves, perhaps more health crises in their home, perhaps more stresses in the family, because every month it's a question whether we will be able to continue to live in this same place that we live. All of those things put stresses on a child. Going back to the work of the previous presenters, whether this is a hidden disability or whether this is a cognitive stressor or whatever else, all of those things are potential challenges that make it even more important that I, the adult working with this child and any other children in my class who have these challenges, my corrections have to be much more gentle. Getting emotionally upset at a kid who doesn't have huge life challenges, this child who has so many, who has perhaps close to a Lake Woebegone life, if I get impatient with that kid, this kid has so many advantages that it's probably not going to cause any big problems. A child who has lots of trauma, though, or whatever else, I need to be gentle but relentless in my high expectations and my corrections. I need to probably be much, much more conscious on the I of STOIC, of working to build a relationship with this kid. Saying hi to this kid, and if you're teaching in an environment where 95% of your children are coming from poverty, you need to greet those students at the door, and you need to say good morning to every single one of those students. I actually have a videotape from one of the districts that we work with longitudinally. In fact, it's Wichita, and there's a teacher in that district in Wichita who developed a unique handshake with every single kid, and because she's been doing this for multiple years now, she has over 100 individual handshakes that she remembers, that kids come up to her in the hall, and she remembers the sequence of the fist bump and the whatever it happens to be with this particular kid. That is such a way to honor a child. If you're teaching in a high poverty environment, you even need to be more meticulous about the O of observe. Do we have playground supervisors who have zones, who physically circulate throughout their zone, who while they're circulating in their zone, they're interacting positively, they're correcting calmly? Because if we have a high poverty environment, these are children who are under a lot of tension and a lot of stress, and more of them may have anger management problems, and if we don't supervise the playground well, we increase the probability that some of our children may get into a fight. So I guess to kind of wrap up this answer, it would be the greater the challenges that your children have, and how will you know they have challenges? You'll see more challenging misbehavior. You'll see more off-task behavior. You'll see more anger behavior, etc. The more challenges an individual has, the more challenges a class collectively has, the more challenges that a school collectively has, the better we need to be in implementing these things. Children who come from some ideal environments, they need us to be good teachers. They'll probably be fine, even if we're only adequate teachers. But children who have many life stresses, whether that's poverty, whether that's neurological deficits, whether it is a identified disability, whether it's a hidden disability, the more behavioral challenges a child has, the more they need us to be ongoing lifelong learners, to continue to adapt our own style, but to make sure that within our own style as an educator, we're also growing in really all five categories of the puzzle pieces of structure, teach, observe, interact positively, and correct calmly.
There we go. We're going to have to leave it there, but what an important topic to leave us all thinking about here. Thank you, Randy, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us here today. The listeners were incredibly engaged today. For all of you listening in, this is the end of our Winter-Spring Eureka series. The series was a fantastic way for us to start the new year and to wrap up and prepare for another academic year coming next year. So if you were unable to attend the earlier webinars in this series, the presentation that Randy referred to by Dr. Laurie Desatel, as well as the webinar with Dr. Izzo and LaDerek Horn are available on demand on the Presence Learning website. You can watch the entire series and earn a special place in our hearts if you share it with your colleagues. For those of you who are clinicians, please go online to our site and apply. We are always looking for fantastic, talented clinicians who are looking to join our team and help transform their field and make a big difference in the lives of countless kids out there. You can check out presencelearning.com/join. So summer is here, but we have plenty more PD for you. We are thrilled to have Dr. Julie Weatherly back by popular demand. You've seen her packed conference sessions across the country. She is a renowned special education legal consultant, and we are delighted to be having her back. Expect a lot of practical advice that will help keep you cool in these hot summer months here. Watch for the details on our email list and make plans to attend this event, please. Looking ahead, we're getting lots of interest in the speakers for our Fall 2017 series. We have a great lineup. Dr. Howie Knopf, former president of NASP, as well as a well-known consultant on school reform and effectiveness, will kick us off on September 19th. Then in October, Dr. Jean Wanzik, who's an expert on MTSS in elementary reading, will take a close look at why we fall short in meeting our early literacy goals. We'll wrap up that three-part series on November 29th with Dr. Carol Ann Tomlinson, the world's most well-known and respected expert on differentiated instruction. That will be a fantastic one. These three webinars are an exceptional opportunity for top-quality professional development for your entire staff. You don't have to travel. You don't have to spend precious budget dollars. They're all free, so please invite your teams to attend well ahead of time to make sure that they can attend. If you haven't heard already, we are now authorized, Presence Learning is authorized to provide the Woodcock-Johnson Cognitive and Achievement Test online through our partnership with Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. We also provide a full suite of online behavioral and mental health services. You might want to see for yourself how this works and how it can reduce the backlog for your school psychologist. To arrange a demonstration, please contact us at schools@presencelearning.com. You can also see a quick video on how that works at plearn.co/WJIV-demo. That's plearn.co/WJIV-demo. All right, what you've been waiting for. If you would like a certificate of attendance, please stay online and take a short quiz covering today's topic. At the conclusion of the program, we'll present you with the quiz as well as with the survey. A score of 80% or higher on the quiz gets you an email with a link to your certificate of attendance. If you don't pass it first, keep at it because retakes are allowed. AOTA and NASP members, your certificate will contain the information you need to self-report for CPDs. We'll also send you an email by tomorrow with a link to the recording of this webinar and its associated materials. Thank you to all of you for being a part of our programs. All of us here at Presence Learning are deeply committed to helping you close the achievement gap, and part of that commitment is bringing you advice from the world's most respected experts during our PD webinars. If you'd like more information on Presence again or our online therapy solutions, you can see the links here or email schools@presencelearning.com. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us.